All right. Matthew chapter 16, and we're going to look beginning with verse 1. It says there, the Pharisees also with the Sadducees came and tempting desired him that he would show them a sign from heaven. And that's the only verse I'm going to read at the onset of this study here tonight. May the Lord bless what we read and study. The Pharisees and the Sadducees. If you look at the title of my Bible study tonight, it is Confrontation with the Hypocrites. These men were indeed hypocrites, especially, Jesus called the Pharisees hypocrites, but the Sadducees were as well. These were two different groups, and who were they? I'm going to explain who the Sadducees and the Pharisees were in just a moment. But we see that they came tempting Jesus. There's a confrontation here, as I said in the title of this study. There's a confrontation between Jesus and them. They wanted to stop Jesus and his advancement of the kingdom and everything that he was doing. They wanted to interfere. They were always negatively against Jesus. And he always had to deal with these people. Now we see that they're asking for a sign. They're asking for him to do some kind of a miracle, as though they had not seen any miracles to this point. How ridiculous in our minds that they would come and ask for another sign or ask for another miracle. I mean, after all, if those men had have been watching, they would have seen that Jesus fed 5,000 plus people with 2 fishes and 5 loaves of bread. If those men had been watching, they would have seen that he had just fed 4,000 plus Gentiles with a few fishes and 7 loaves of bread. If those men had been watching, they would have seen that Jesus, if they were around or maybe even heard, they would have known that Jesus calmed a storm and walked on water. If those men had been watching, they would have seen that he had healed a man who had leprosy, a woman who had a blood disease. They would have seen that he raised a synagogue ruler's daughter, Jairus' daughter, from the dead. They would have seen that he had healed one of the disciples' mother-in-law of a fever. They would have seen that he had healed a woman who had been sick with a blood disease for 12 years. They would have seen that he had healed 2 blind men. They would have seen and taken notice of and heard or known that he had cast out demons from a demon-possessed man and then cast them into a herd of pigs that drowned in a sea. So they would have seen all of this if they had been watching. And maybe they were. Maybe those men were. But they're asking for another sign. And the one that they're asking for is a sign from heaven. So all those miracles that I just told you about were things that Jesus had done for people while on this earth. But they were not something that had come down directly from heaven, supernaturally in the skies, something maybe the planets or the sun or the stars that God would use or utilize in performing some kind of a divine miracle in the sky. They hadn't seen anything like that. So those men, they approached Jesus, and it says here, they said, "Show us a sign from heaven." Now, the reason why for this is, and I'm going to explain why they did this. You may never have known this. If you hadn't, you're hearing it now. But it was believed by people in biblical times, if someone, a prophet or someone performed a miracle, that miracle could easily be duplicated by a magician or someone who is a worshiper of or a servant of the devil. That the devil could do something as well. But a miracle from the skies, from the heavens, they would consider that to be directly from God. And so they thought, well, if you are really the Messiah, then you prove it by showing us a miracle that only God can do, not something that can be duplicated, imitated, or copied by someone else. Now, I'd love to see someone else try to feed 4,000 or 5,000 plus people with a handful of food, as if anyone else could have done that. But anyway, that's why these men, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, approached him to tempt him, trying to trick him and saying, you do a miracle from heaven. And if you do that, then you'll show that we are God. Now, reading between the lines, they didn't say that. I'm reading between the lines, and I'm suggesting or I'm insinuating that that's what they're thinking. Okay? Now, but he answered and said unto them, when it is evening, you say that it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and lowering. O ye hypocrites, ye can discern the face of the sky, but can you not discern the signs of the times? And you may wonder, what in the world does that mean? Well, back in those days, a lot of people, they didn't have the weather Dopplers and the prognosticators and the meteorologists that we watch, who will tell us that we're going to get a foot of snow and then it does nothing. Yeah, that's just a little fun there. But anyway, no, they're usually pretty accurate. But they didn't have things like that. They didn't. So they would try to learn ways to predict the weather. And it was believed that if the sun rises in the east, they say, and sets in the west. It says, believe that when the sun is setting, and you have the beautiful orange, reddish color sky, that is a sign that you're going to have beautiful, nice, pleasant weather the next day. But if the sun is rising in the east and the sky is a fiery red color, then that is a sign, a visible sign, that there is going to be bad weather in that day, because it means there's a lot of water in the atmosphere. And it was belief that people went by that means there would be bad weather. And in fact, there's an old saying that sailors would use in regards to that, and it went like this: red sky at night, sailor's delight; red sky in the morning, sailor's warning. Now, Jesus said, with that, you predict the weather. Just very common things like that. You look at the color of the sky, and you sort of kind of predict the weather and things like that. He said, you can do that, but then you cannot, the latter part of verse 3, you cannot discern the times, the signs of the times. You cannot see that all that I am doing is saying Jesus, that is a sign of the times that the Messiah has come. You can't even discern that. He said, a wicked and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, verse 4, and there shall no sign be given unto it, but the sign of the prophet Jonah. And he left them and departed. All right, so I went to another passage that we looked at recently in this same book, Matthew chapter 12. Where another time the Pharisees had come to Jesus and said the same thing, show us a sign. And he responded the same way. He said in Matthew chapter 12, 39 and 40, he said, an evil and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and there shall no sign be given unto it, but the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Now, what Jesus was telling them was, I am not going to please you men, you Pharisees and Sadducees. I'm not going to stand here and give you what you wish. You want me to do something miraculous in the skies to prove that I am who I say I am. I'm not going to do that, says Jesus. There's only one sign that I leave with you, and it's the sign of Jonah. As he's in the belly of the whale, 3 days and 3 nights. The Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights, and then he will resurrect from the dead. And that is Jesus telling them that he is going to die and resurrect from the dead. That's basically what he was saying to them. He said, that's all you need to know. Now, as we go on, we find it says in verse 5, when his disciples were come to the other side, they had forgotten to take bread. Those men, good gracious, they were always forgetting to take their lunch. I mean, when Jesus was preaching to the people out there and next to the shore of Galilee, there's over 5,000 people, and they had nothing to eat. They had to borrow lunch from a little boy. And then when he was preaching to the Gentiles, same thing. They had nothing to, and they had no food to eat. So they forgot to take the bread. But wait a minute, Matthew said that, but actually Mark says in chapter 8, verse 14, in his version, they did at least have one loaf. Mark said in Mark 8:14, now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, neither had they in the ship with them more than one loaf. And when I'm talking about a loaf, I'm not talking about a loaf of bread that we'd go over here to Food Line and buy over that way. I'm not talking about a loaf of bread like that. When we see a loaf here, it's a little small piece of bread. That's all they had. How are they going to divide that among 13 men? But anyway, of course, Jesus, if he could feed 5,000 plus and 4,000 plus in 2 separate miracles, I think he could handle 13 men. No problem at all. But that's not the point here. We find that they forgot their bread. And Jesus said to them, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees. Beware of their leaven. Now, leaven is what you put in bread to make it rise. And leaven in the Old Testament was typified as sin. It was representative of sin, evil. And the Israelites were told to eat unleavened bread when they left in the Exodus from Egypt. They were not to have any leaven in the homes or in their lives. They were to get rid of it. And so the disciples, when they heard Jesus saying, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, those 12 disciples, they're probably thinking he's talking about beware of the sin of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. To a certain extent, I guess he was. But that's not exactly what he's talking about. And those men also, when they heard the word leaven, since leaven makes bread rise, it makes it fluffy and all, they're thinking maybe he's talking about bread here. And so it says they reasoned among themselves, verse 7, and saying, it is because we have taken no bread. He's noticed, he heard us talking about or realized that we have no bread here to eat, just that one little loaf. And Peter's over there fighting to keep it to himself. No, I'm just kidding. That's nowhere in the Bible. But they reasoned among themselves, maybe he's talking about the fact we have no bread. And when Jesus perceived it, see, Jesus knows everything. He sees all, he hears all, he knows all. Whatever we're thinking in our mind, others may not know, but he does. There's nothing we can hide from God. And so when Jesus perceived or understood and knew that those men were talking about not having any bread, he looked at them and just simply said, "O ye of little faith." There's been that's not the only time Jesus told his disciples, "O ye of little faith." And we can look at it and say he's being mean to them, right? No. He could very easily have said, "O ye of no faith." At least he acknowledged and recognized they had some faith. But he said, "O ye of little faith, Why reason ye among yourselves because ye have no bread? You're just wasting your time, says Jesus. You're just sitting around, standing around, whatever they were doing, talking about the fact that you have nothing to eat. You have no bread. And then Jesus automatically, right then and there, started mentioning about the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000. And he said to them, verse 9, do you not understand? Neither remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many baskets you took up? And remember, last Sunday I said those baskets were like a picnic basket that a person would carry his lunch in. And he said in verse 9, or verse 10, neither the 7 loaves of the 4,000 and how many baskets you took up, and those baskets, there were 7 of them, and those baskets were big enough that a human body could sit in. And I gave the illustration that the people let Paul down out the window in one of such large basket for his safety. And he said, don't you remember that? I fed 4,000 people and 5,000 plus people, and you're worried about bread? He's probably thinking, I can handle 13. It's a piece of cake. No problem. He said, how is it that you don't understand that I'm not speaking to you concerning bread, food? I'm not speaking to you concerning food or bread. He said, when I say beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees, I'm talking about something else. And what was he talking about? Well, they understood it. They realized he's talking about not so much bread or their sins, even though leaven means represents sin, but he's talking about their doctrine. How do I know that? They said it. Verse 12, look at it. Then understood they, that is Peter, John, Andrew, James, all of those men, then understood they how that he bade them not beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees. Now, Jesus had often called these men hypocrites. Confrontation with the hypocrites. And Luke chapter 12, verse 1 says, in the meantime, one day, when there were gathered together an innumerable multitude of people, insomuch that they trode one upon another, he began to say to his disciples, first of all, beware ye of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. So in Luke's version, Luke mentioned that Jesus said it is hypocrisy of these men. Who were the Sadducees and the Pharisees? I'm going to tell you who they were. I'm not the most knowledgeable. I'm not the best schooled. I'm not the most intelligent to know the differences between the two, but I know basics. And I'm going to share a few of those basics with you. The Sadducees were considered to be liberals. The Pharisees were considered to be legalists. The Sadducees accepted and believed in the first 5 books of the Bible. They call it the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Sadducees believed in that part of the scripture. They rejected, did not accept the prophets or any other part of scripture. Only the first 5 books. Whereas the Pharisees accepted the Torah, the first 5 books, as well as the prophets and oral traditions. Now that's where the Sadducees and the Pharisees really bickered and didn't like each other. One of the main reasons. Because the Jewish people believed that in the Old Testament there are 613 commands from God. And the Pharisees came up with what they called fence laws, or a barrier to protect those 613 commands by having as many as 1,500 other laws that did not come from God, but came from them, from man. They called it the oral traditions. And they believed, they were very strict on this, and they taught that the people were to abide by and take heed to and believe in, accept, and live by those oral traditions. Sadducees said, no way, no. It's the first 5 books of the Bible, that only. Pharisees, no, it's the prophets too, as well as the oral traditions, and they are holy and binding, according to those men. They were about as different as Republicans and Democrats. The Sadducees rejected the resurrection. They did not believe in life after death. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection because they believed in life after death. You might say, well, I'm a little bit more leaning toward the Pharisees based on their doctrinal beliefs. Well, just hear the whole story. Let me tell you that the Sadducees did not believe in the unseen world. They did not believe in demons or angels. But the Pharisees did. They believed in demons. They believed in the spirit world. The Sadducees were aristocrats. They were wealthy. The priest came from the Sadducees. They ruled in the temple. The Pharisees were more of the common man's leader, and they ruled from and led in the synagogues. The Sadducees welcomed and accepted Hellenism. The Pharisees did not. Hellenism was changing the culture to a Greek culture. The Sadducees welcomed that. The Pharisees did not. So you can see that they're very different. They're vastly different, those groups of men. Let me tell you this too, that both of these groups, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, as well as scribes, made up what is called the Jewish Supreme Court. It's called the Sanhedrin, of which Jesus had to appear before during his mock trial. There were more Sadducees on the Sanhedrin, or the Supreme Court, than there were Pharisees. But there were Pharisees in the Sanhedrin. And they differed, those two groups. They were so, like I said, they were vastly different. There were 70 members in the Sanhedrin, by the way. One time, Paul mentioned this in his book in Acts chapter 23, verses 6 through 8. By the way, Paul, before he became Paul, the missionary, was Saul, a Pharisee. Did you know that? He was a Pharisee who had persecuted the church. In fact, that's what Saul was doing on the day he met Jesus on Damascus Road. He had plans that day to persecute Christians. Jesus had another plan, to detour him in his life and get him on the right road and save him and call him to be a missionary for the Gentiles. So Saul, he was a Pharisee, and one time he was arrested for preaching the gospel when he became Paul the missionary. And in Acts 23, 6 through 8, it says this, listen, one day Paul perceived that in that Sanhedrin, Paul had to go before that Jewish Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, which consisted of Sadducees and Pharisees and scribes. And so Paul perceived that one part or part of them were Sadducees and the other part or part of them were Pharisees. And he cried out in the council and he said, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, of the hope and resurrection of the dead I am called in question. Paul said, I was a Pharisee, and I've been preaching that Jesus died on the cross, was buried, and in 3 days he came forth alive from the dead. Those Sadducees, boy, you could just visualize how they probably reacted to that. Remember, the Sadducees, the liberals, did not accept or believe in the resurrection from the dead. And when Paul said that, it ruffled their feathers and rubbed them wrong. It made them angry, furiously angry. And then it says in verse 7 of Acts 23 that when Paul had said that, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the multitude was divided. Those two groups were always divided, always butting heads, bumping into each other and disagreeing. They despised one another. Pharisees hated Sadducees, vice versa. Sadducees hated them. And there was such a division in that time when Paul was before the Sanhedrin. Verse 8 says, "For the Sadducees say there's no resurrection, neither is there an angel nor spirits, but the Pharisees confess and they believe both." Now, it is said that a Roman commander then had to send Roman soldiers down to rescue Paul because it got so out of control in that Sanhedrin, in that meeting, that Roman soldiers had to go get Paul and escort him out for his safety. Those men couldn't stand each other. They weren't all wrong or bad. There were some good ones. I mean, you read in John chapter 3, Nicodemus was a Pharisee. He came to Jesus by night to find out how he can have meaning for his life, and Jesus showed him how to be saved. He came to him by night out of fear that if he was seen in the daytime associating or talking with Jesus, then he'd be in trouble with his peers. But it says in John chapter 3, 1 and 2, a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews, saying came to Jesus by night, and said unto him, "Rabbi, we know that thou art a teacher come from God, for no man can do these miracles, the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000, the raising of the dead, the casting out of the demons. No man can do these miracles except God be with them." Nicodemus said that. And yet the Sadducees and Pharisees, they were saying, "Show us a sign from heaven. Prove that you are God." It took a Pharisee named Nicodemus to say, all that you're doing, that's evidence you're God. And there's another good Pharisee too. His name was Joseph of Arimathea, who had loaned his grave. Didn't give it to him. He loaned it because he knew Jesus would only need it for 3 days. But Joseph of Arimathea loaned his grave for Jesus to be buried in. But I tell you that those men, what is this coming to, this Bible study tonight? What am I going to end up with? How am I going to end it? I'm going to end it this way by saying that those men differed doctrinally. Jesus said, beware of their leaven, or beware of their doctrines. They differed so much. They hated each other so much. But they had one common ground. One common ground, those two different groups. Vastly different. Different as night and day. One common interest. And that was to destroy Jesus. To kill him. They wanted to stop him. Neither group accepted, or believed in Jesus as the Messiah. And that was their common interest. That was the thing that they wanted to do. They tried to have their way. Jesus looked at them and he called them hypocrites. Those men acted holier than thou, holier than anyone else, better than anyone else. And Jesus said to them one time, and particularly to the Pharisees in Matthew 23:27, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you liken white as sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanliness." So Jesus confronted them, and he dealt with it. Jesus was radical, and he was bold. And let us not any of us ever think Jesus was wimpy. He was the toughest man that ever lived. I say that flat out, and I say it with great emphasis. The strongest, toughest man that ever lived, because no one who's ever lived would ever have been able to have laid down on a cross and bear all the sins of the whole world. What a man Jesus was. That's our Bible study for this evening. I hope you got something from it. Let us pray. We thank you, Lord.